Well, what I first of all like to do is to go through the parallel record to the birth of Jesus in Luke's Gospel, which is where we don't read about the star, but it's the parallel record to pick up some of the narrative. Later on, when there's quite a few verses we look at one after the other to make a point, then that they are on the screen. But we're going to look up some of these in our Bibles. Go with me then to Luke chapter 2. Go to Luke chapter 2 and verse 4. Luke chapter 2 and verse 4. And we read, "And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth unto Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary his espoused wife, being great with child." So a family go from Nazareth in Galilee, northern Israel, to stay in Bethlehem, despite the wife Mary being heavily pregnant. And the reason we see, we need to worry about the detail, is in verses 1 to 3. We see that a law had been enacted where everyone had to take part in what was effectively a census, and that to pay a tax, so like a poll tax. The idea of being enrolled, to take part in a census. And he went to the city that your family came from. And in the following verses then we have the classic Nativity story, and there's just a few points we need to pick up as we go through. So let's just have a look through that. Verse 6, "It came to pass that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes," that's where we almost like bandages, "and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, an angel of the Lord came upon them," that's the shepherds, "and the glory of the Lord," this great light, bright light of the Lord, shone round about them, and they were sore afraid." And these shepherds on the hillside are scared by what they've seen. This bright light appears. "And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord." Let's just pause there a moment. In verse 9, we have this very bright light. This is the angel of Yahweh, God's own representative, and it dazzles and unsurprisingly scares some shepherds on a hillside outside Bethlehem. We note from verse 11, it says, "For unto you is born this day in the city of David," which is Bethlehem, "a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord." So it's the very day of the birth of this child. And then if we go now to verse 12, "This shall be a sign unto you. You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." You're going to know exactly it's the right person, because it's pretty unusual to find a child laying in a manger, which was like a trough for feeding cattle. "And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, as other angels praising God." So this one angel appears in very bright, dazzling light to these shepherds, tells them what they're going to see, tells them a baby has been born today, and there's a whole load of other angels appear. And it tells us they're angels, because it says in verse 15, "It came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them, the shepherds, into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, Let us now go even into Bethlehem, and see this thing which has come to pass, which the Lord has made known to us. And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger." So if you weren't sure, we're told that they're all angels, this heavenly host, and they disappear, and the shepherds then hurry into Bethlehem and find the baby the same day it was born. Verse 17, "And when they, the shepherds, had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told to them concerning the child." They told everyone about it, what they'd seen and heard. Verse 19, "All they that heard it wondered at those things which they were told by the shepherds. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. And the shepherds returned to where they come from, the hills outside Bethlehem, glorifying and praising God for all the things they'd heard and seen as it was spoken to them." So they tell all around, and everyone wonders as a result, everyone marvels as what the shepherds are telling them. So lots of people are told about this baby by the shepherds, and they marvel at the news. The shepherds then return to the fields they'd come from in verse 8. And this all takes place in the period when Jesus was no more than a day old in Bethlehem. Well, then we move on in time a little bit, because in verse 21 it says, "Now when 8 days were accomplished for the circumcising of the child," this was the ceremony which took place after 8 days, "his name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb." So Jesus here, this is 8 days after his birth. Now, I'm going to say I don't think that with a newborn child, their family would have had time to go all the way back up to Nazareth. I think they were still in the Bethlehem or Jerusalem area at the time. Bethlehem is just outside Jerusalem. I think these days it's more or less a suburb of Jerusalem, but it's just outside Jerusalem. Can I just take you, keep a bookmark or something in Luke, and if I can just take you back to Leviticus chapter 12. And this is talks about the ritual, the law that they had to fulfill. Leviticus chapter 12. We'll get to the star in a moment. Leviticus chapter 12. It says, "The Lord spake unto Moses," verse 1, saying, "Speak unto the children of Israel, if a woman have conceived seed and bear a man child," is what we have here, "then she shall be unclean 7 days." So she had to keep herself separate, unclean, ceremonial unclean for 7 days. "According to the days of the separation of her infirmity shall she be unclean." So for those 7 days, it wouldn't have been appropriate for them to travel and go to Nazareth anyway. Mary had to keep herself separate with a newborn child. Verse 3, "And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised," which we're told they did, "and she," that's the mother, "shall then continue in the blood of her purifying 33 days. She shall touch no hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying be fulfilled." So there's this period of 8 days and then 33 days that she wasn't allowed that she was unclean, if you like. As Luke, wasn't it? Luke chapter 2. We saw the law relating to childbirth. If we take 8 days and then the 33 days, we find that Mary, that Joseph and Jesus went into the temple potentially on the 40th day after the birth of Jesus. Let's go down in Luke chapter 2 again. Verse 22, "When the days of her purification according to the law of Moses were accomplished." So we've got 8 days up to the circumcision and then 33 days. So potentially this is the 41st day after the birth of Jesus. "When the days of her purification according to the law of Moses are accomplished, they brought him," Jesus, "to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written in the law of the Lord. Every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy unto the Lord." And there's this ceremony they had to do then in Jerusalem. And this was 41 days after the birth. Now, again, I don't know if they would have had time with a newborn to go all the way back up to Nazareth to then come all the way back down to Jerusalem. It's possible that they stayed in the area. It seems unlikely that they would have gone all the way back to Nazareth and back. And once these ceremonies had been performed, then in verse 39, "And when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned unto Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth." And I'm going to put it to you, for those 40 days, first 40 days of his life, Jesus was in and around Jerusalem. And then they headed back north to Galilee. So day 0, day of the birth of their shepherds visit the newborn. Day 8 is circumcised. Then day potentially 41, there's offerings in the temple, and then they return to Nazareth. And I've put at the bottom there is another important point, that we know that every year Jesus went to Jerusalem every year. Presumably the first time was when he was at that 40-day age, where they performed those ceremonies. But we know from then on, Jesus went annually to Jerusalem at the Passover, which is around March, April time. We didn't go into that, but we have the story, don't we, when he was 12 years old and the family went to Jerusalem, as they did every year, to celebrate the Passover. And Jesus was found in the temple. He was lost from the party on the way home. It is actually in Luke chapter 2, if you look in verse 41. "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover." So from the age of 0, Jesus was going to Jerusalem every year around the feast of the Passover. And when he's 12 years old, in verse 42, he's specifically recorded as being in this on this trip. Now let's go then to Matthew and reconcile the Matthew record with what we've seen in Luke. And this is where we do read of the star. Matthew chapter 2. So verse 1, it says, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." Now some translations have Jesus having been born. And this was almost certainly sometime after the birth of Jesus. It wasn't at the same time. It was after the birth of Jesus. Jesus having been born in Bethlehem, these things are now going to happen. We know from the other record that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. His family were only there as visitors. And we see in verse 1 that the wise men didn't go to Bethlehem. They came from the east and they went to Jerusalem. So why, if Jesus was born in Bethlehem, did the wise men go to Jerusalem? Well, either they knew that Jesus was in Jerusalem, they'd been told he was, or they more likely assumed that the king of the Jews, who they were seeking to worship, would be born in Jerusalem, the capital, or they weren't very wise. They were misinformed. But they didn't go to Bethlehem. I don't believe that they in any way went to Bethlehem. Well, let's think about who these were. We're told in the Orthodox version there came wise men from the east from Jerusalem. Well, the word translated wise men is the Greek word magos, which is associated with the word we think of as magic or magician. And these were a group of people derived from ancient Babylon. As I say, it's probably where they get the idea of magic from it. And they were scientists, sorcerers, or magicians. The only other place we read of this word in the New Testament, we need to turn there, it's in Acts chapter 13, where we read of a man called Elymas, translated as Bar Jesus, who is described as a sorcerer and a false prophet. But in the Old Testament, there are quite a few places where magicians are mentioned. The Hebrew word for this is, it's written Khartom, Khartom, which means a horoscopist. Now, horoscopist, you think of your horoscopes. I pick up the free newspaper on the train in the morning, and I look at the crossword and try not to look at the horoscope. You know, it's the horoscope which tells you that because Venus is in Sagittarius and you're in Aries, you can have a bad day and all this. And we do know it's nonsense, but where does that nonsense come from? Well, a horoscopist was somebody who draws lines and circles, and the Babylonians were great astronomers. They could tell you where the planets and the sun and the moon were going to be in the future. That they were very good at this. They even devised they were able to predict even eclipses of the sun, and their mathematics is what devised the calculations that go behind that. So these magicians were what we would know today as astrologers. And the word Magian, we see this in another form in the Old Testament. In Jeremiah, for instance, it says, "And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate," and there's some names of these people, Rabsaris and Rab-Mag, with all the residue of the princes of the king of Babylon. So one of the king of Babylon's men was called Rab-Mag. Rab means a chief, and he was the chief Magian. He was the chief astrologer, the science minister of the king of Babylon. These are wise men. These were the scientists of their day. Now, is there anything else that we can do to work out who these wise men were? Well, in verse 1 of Matthew 2, we're told they came from the east to Jerusalem. I think this is the clearest map in the world, but we've got Jerusalem over here. And if we travel east, we come to, well, there we are, Babylon. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is the location of this once mighty kingdom of Babylon, who was spoken of in that verse in Isaiah. So did these wise men come from here, or maybe somewhere further east, such as India or China? Well, they seem to have been expecting a Jewish king to be born. Verse 2 of Matthew 2, they say, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. They seem to be expecting a Jewish king to be born, one who would be worthy of worship by them in their land. So why would astrologers, scientists, be expecting a Jewish king to be born, and why would they want to worship this king, and what was the star that they saw? Well, there's some other clues maybe we get from the magicians of the Old Testament. Come back with me to Genesis chapter 41. I think we went to Genesis 41 this morning. Genesis 41. And there's some magicians. And this is during the plagues in Egypt. And verse 8 of Genesis 41, it came to pass in the morning that's Pharaoh's spirit was troubled. And because I can't remember which plague we're up to now. It was the dream he saw, wasn't it, of the cattle. And in the morning we're told Pharaoh was troubled, and he called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, and there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. So this was the magicians, the wise men, the science advisors to Pharaoh of Egypt, who were unable to tell Pharaoh anything about the dream he had had, and that they were a bit useless, really. But this was in the days of Joseph, who was able, given by God, the power to interpret these dreams. 400 years later, if we go to Exodus chapter 7, we have a different Pharaoh and some different magicians, some different science advisors in Exodus chapter 7. And this is during the plagues. It was not the famine. This is now during the plagues of Egypt. Exodus chapter 7 and verse 21. And the fish that were in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So somehow they were able to replicate this first plague and so on, and another one in chapter 8 as well. And then later on, they're unable to replicate the plagues. They admit they don't have power to do this. Interestingly, we're in the second letter to Timothy, Paul refers to these magicians and gives them their names, Jannes and Jambres. And it talks, and Paul says they're like people today who are always learning but never find the truth. True of many scientists today who know so much about apparently the visible universe, but then believe in evolution. They just don't know the truth. And Paul goes on to compare the magicians of Pharaoh with the corrupt minds who reject the truth of God's word. There's another place where we read of magicians, these wise men, and that's in the book of Daniel. Come with me to Daniel chapter 1. And the book of Daniel takes place in the area around Babylon. Daniel was one of some Hebrews, Jews, taken to live in captivity in Babylon, the sophisticated world power of its day. Daniel was one of 4 captives who were selected for their skill and knowledge to advise the king, to be the science advisors, the advisors to the king. And in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 20 of Daniel, it says, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king required of them, he found them, that's Daniel and his 3 colleagues, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even into the first year of King Cyrus. And in Daniel chapter 2, we then find that the king Nebuchadnezzar, he expects his magicians and sorcerers to tell him about a dream that he's had, and worries him, but he can't remember it. And of course they can't. And it's Daniel who is able to interpret this dream. And Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we won't go into it, was all about a future king and a future kingdom. And Daniel believed in a future Messiah, an anointed one who would be king of the Jews, one who would be separated and holy, consecrated to be the king of the Jews. when I was separated to be a king of the Jews. He was even given a time span of how long it would be. If I just take you to this verse, it is on the screen from Daniel chapter 9. Daniel was given this prophecy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again on the wall, even in troublous times. So it's a bit of a riddle. We haven't got time to go into the detail of it, but basically Daniel was given a time span of when the countdown would begin to basically the birth of Jesus, the coming of the appearance of this long-promised Hebrew Jewish king, and it would start when a proclamation went out, the going forth of the commandment of Storus as a decree of Cyrus, and there was this timeline given from Daniel's day to when this king would be born. And all the wise men of Babylon knew about this. They all respected Daniel. This time countdown will begin when a command was given to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, it's a bit of speculation here, but we've laid a good foundation to base on. Daniel, the faithful Jew, has been in charge of all these so-called magicians and sorcerers of Babylon. He was given leadership over them. He believed in a future king ruling in Jerusalem. He had been told when the countdown would begin to the birth of this king. I'm certain he and they would have told anybody and everybody about this, like the shepherds did. They told everybody. And the wise men of Babylon knew about these things. The things Daniel said were written down, they remembered. And even after the Babylonian Empire was conquered and the empires that followed, there were those living in the East who remembered these things and passed them on. And I believe the wise men who came to Jerusalem sometime after the birth of Jesus knew what Daniel had been taught. Their ancestors were those who lived and worked with Daniel. They knew the command to rebuild Jerusalem had gone out centuries before, and they knew that they were living in the time when the birth of this king would happen. We mentioned astrology. The whole ridiculous notion of horoscopes can be traced back to ancient Babylon. And the key part of this idea that you could foretell events by looking at the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, sun, moon, and planets against the stars. Well, these men, because of that tradition, I suppose, were looking in the sky for a sign. They were looking in the sky for a sign that this Hebrew king would be born. They may have been looking in the wrong place, but God rewarded their patience by giving them a sign in the place they were looking for. And so something appeared in the sky, which to them was a star that they'd been looking for. Well, the birth of Christ was notified to the Jewish shepherds by an angel. It was notified to these Gentile philosophers by a star. God spoke to them in their own way, through their own understanding. I've just got a quote from a commentary here. It says, the birth of Christ was notified to the Jewish shepherds by an angel, to the Gentile philosophers by a star. But to both, God spoke in their own language and in the way they were both best acquainted with. And the wise men, on seeing this sign that they believed to be their signal that this Jewish king had now been born, set off to Jerusalem, not to Bethlehem, but to Jerusalem. So what did they see? Well, there's a lot of popular ideas around this. A few months or so ago now, I was in the back garden with my binoculars looking at a comet. It was quite faint, it was quite low down, but it was a comet. Some of you may remember back in 1996, there was a comet called Hale-Bopp, which was very bright and visible for quite a few weeks. It was really dramatic. I think there's a slightly stylized photograph here of a comet. Was it a comet? Well, a comet will appear in the sky for quite some period of time, and will be visible to quite a few. And there's a suggestion that around the time of the birth of Jesus, that Halley's comet might have been visible. It's portrayed in a famous old painting here. Probably see it on the front of a Christmas card or something. Was it possibly Halley's comet? But that would have moved through the sky. It would have been visible to a lot of people. We'll see if any of these fit the facts in Matthew 2 in a moment. it's been suggested it might have been a conjunction. A conjunction is where you get two bright things in the sky together. I think that particular conjunction is possibly Venus and Jupiter. Now, it was clear last night, and just around sunset, which of course at this time of year is about 4 o'clock, just above the sunset in the west, Venus was very bright, and then just above the other direction in the east, Jupiter is quite bright. But there are occasions when they're both together in the sky. I've seen them almost on top of each other, and it's very prominent, very bright. Was it something like that? Well, everyone around the world would have seen it. But what we see in a moment is it's just the wise men saw their star. Was it so again a conjunction? Maybe Venus with a very bright star. There is a constellation called Leo, the lion, potentially. Maybe that's the lion of the tribe of Judah. Venus very bright in that. I don't know. This picture is you don't quite see there. I didn't take this picture. There's a crescent moon in the star in the clouds up there, and there's also, and this did happen a few years ago, visible from the UK. It was an evening where the crescent moon was in the sky, and just above the sunset was also Jupiter and Venus, and it formed a little smiley face with the Jupiter and Venus and the moon. Was it a conjunction of these things the wise men saw? There's a bit more detail. That did happen a few years ago. Was it a nova? Now there's a constellation which I'm never quite sure how to pronounce. I think it's called Bootes, Bootes, but there's some dots above one of the O's. It's a constellation it represents a herdsman, and he's herding animals along. And next to this, there's a constellation called Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown, and there's a star in the Northern Crown which is so faint you can't see it. So faint you can't see it. You need a very large telescope to see it, but every 76 years or so, it flares up so bright that it's suddenly visible with the naked eye. Suddenly there's a new star appears. Maybe that was it. It last flared up in 1946, and before that in 18 something or other, and before that around the time of the French Revolution. Or was it a nova, a star which explodes at the end of its sort of life and suddenly becomes visible? That's actually a galaxy, another galaxy where a supernova exploding star was visible, appears for a period of time and disappears. Do these fit in with what the shepherds saw? Well, let's go back to Daniel 2 and see what they actually saw. Do any of those ideas fit in? Matthew chapter 2 and verse 2, they say, "Where is he that is born the King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that being as the sun is setting over there, that is east. So they're saying we've seen a star in the east. Now, if we just go back to the map, they must have been saying, when we were in the east, we saw a star. Because if they'd seen a star in the east and followed it, they'd have gone in that direction, so that's east. So they weren't saying the star was in the east, they were saying that they were in the east. We were in the east, where we came from, and we saw his star, and we come to worship him. So let's go down to verse 7. And this star, it doesn't lead them to Jerusalem. They see it, and that is their signal to follow, to go to Jerusalem. Let's follow what it says, verse 7, where Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Now, what do we learn from this? We learn that Herod hasn't seen this star. In fact, it seems nobody has seen this star. Verse 8, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the young child. When you have found it, bring me word again, so I may come and worship him also." And there's no suggestion in the text that anyone else has seen this star. But they say, "Where is he that is born the King of the Jews? Because we've seen his star in the east." And Herod the king heard these things. He was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Nobody else seems to have seen this star. Nobody else seems to have seen it. There's no suggestion anyone else has seen it. It was their star. It appeared to them, and they saw it. And we need to be careful that we don't put any interpretation on this. and they've gone to Jerusalem, haven't they? And verse 5, it says, they came unto him, that's Herod in they came unto him, they go to Jerusalem, and verse 4, when he, that's Herod, had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them, saying, you should know about all this. You should know your Bibles. Where does it say that Christ is going to be born? And they quote this verse, don't they? And they say unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, thou Bethlehem in the land of Judea art not least among the prince of Judah, for out of thee shall come forth the governor, which shall rule my people Israel. And they say, well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. And Herod thinks, right, I'll send the wise men to Bethlehem then, because they've come to Jerusalem. The star hasn't led them to where Jesus was. It was their signal that told them he was being born, and they, working on what they knew, went to Jerusalem. There's no sense in which the star was sort of above them, leading them along like a sort of a searchlight or something. Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Nobody had seen it. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. Now, a lot of people make a big assumption here that the wise men then went to Bethlehem. It doesn't say that. At no point does it say that the wise men went to Bethlehem. And to say it does and to portray it on Christmas cards or whatever is pure assumption. It's writing in something which isn't there. Because what do? When they heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they saw in the east, when they were in the east, went before till it came and stood over where the young child was. It doesn't say it led them to Bethlehem, because I think Jesus was in Jerusalem. He was somewhere in Jerusalem. Whether it was in that 40-day period after his circumcision and the purification going on, or whether it was a later time, because that every year, it might have been Passover time, when every year his family went to Jerusalem. But we're not told they went to Bethlehem. The star leads just these men to where the young child was. And verse 10, they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were coming to the house, it's a house, not an inn, a stable, a palace, it's a house. Maybe it was the temple, because they went every year to Jerusalem for the Passover. And when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell and worshipped him. And when they'd opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not depart to Herod, not return to Herod, they departed unto their own country another way. And that's all we read of the star. It only seems to appear to the wise men. It only seems to appear to the wise men. There's no suggestion that anybody other than these wise men saw this star. And they rejoice in verse 10 in the same way that the shepherds on seeing the angels, which I think is very significant. We have no more mention of the star. Now, there's nothing in the night sky that behaves like this, just appears to somebody and then appears when they look for it again. There's no star, meteor, comet, planet conjunction, or anything that behaves like this. And if we look at the sky for clues about this, then we're just as bad as the astrologers looking for signs in the sky. We need to look in our Bibles. Now, I'm going to give you my opinion based on all this as to what the wise men saw, and then I'll take you to some verses to back it up. I believe what they saw was the brightness in the sky created by an angel, one of God's messengers, a ministering spirit, possibly the angel of the Lord, who specifically represents God in certain situations. Let's have a look at some places where angels are associated with brightness and light. Or the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, that's Moses, in a flame out of fire in the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. I did mention, didn't I, that the wise men rejoiced when they saw the star in the same way that the shepherds rejoiced when they saw the angels. It came to pass, when the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, that the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. This is on the birth of Samson, and Manoah and his wife looked on it and fell on their faces to the ground. Matthew, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the angel of the Lord descended from heaven. This is the resurrection, and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. And the angel's countenance, his appearance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. In Acts, behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, "Arise up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands with this bright light associated with an angel. Revelation, I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and the rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. After these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. Very similar to what we see with the angels on the hillside. The earth was lightened with his glory. Also in Revelation, I saw an angel standing in the sun. Psalms of the angels makes his angel spirits, his ministers, a flaming fire. And let's think about all the angels around the time of the birth of Jesus. Or I saw an angel appear to Joseph in two places to tell him what was going to happen. They had to go to Bethlehem, they had to care for the child, and go into Egypt. The angel appears to Mary, fear not, Mary. The angel appears to shepherds, fear not, go and see the one who's born today. It seems to me that in the brightness that they saw in the sky, the angels also appeared to the wise men. Just before we finish, a little point. It always strikes me that there's very little in the Bible that happens in isolation. The Bible is full of repeating events and repeating patterns. Well, in the wise men, we have these people who left Mesopotamia, where ancient Babylon was. They're told to leave, not knowing exactly where they're going to go. They go as a group together. They then have to receive guidance from God as to where they have to go before they continue to their journey. And maybe the house they went to where Jesus was the temple, the house of God, and they worshipped the Son of God. And these things all, and they this was the birth, around the birth of the young life of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, there's a similar pattern we see in the Old Testament, and this is in the life of Abraham. He was a man from Mesopotamia. He was told to leave, not knowing where he would go. He left as part of a group. He had to separate himself from those around him. He received a call and guidance from God. When he stopped being guided, the star it disappeared. When he stopped being guided, it made a break in the journey. He then continued his journey. When he responded again to the guidance, the star reappeared, and the wise men were shown to go. And Abraham restarted his journey to Canaan after a break when he was told where to go. Abraham first went to a place he called Bethel, the house of God, and worshipped, and the wise men went to the house where Jesus was. And in John 8 and verse 56, we're told of Abraham that he rejoiced to see the day of Jesus. There are some other verses which talk about stars in the Bible, and we can see from that in the sense of something which is bright, something which is prominent, something which is going to change the lives of people, then the true star in Bethlehem was Jesus himself. As we read in Revelation of Jesus, "I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and the morning star. And there shall come," it's a fulfillment, wasn't it? "There shall come a star out of Jacob, a scepter shall arise of Israel." And we're looking for the return of Christ, aren't we, to this earth? The return of Jesus to reign as king upon this earth. And the last verse I'd like to take to is in Hebrews chapter 9, where it reads, "So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time, without sin, unto salvation." Thank you.